Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Tanya Abingdon-Hope. I'm Provost and Professor of Education at Plymouth Marjon University and Marjon University Cornwall. I'm also the BERA SIG convener for educational effectiveness and improvement, and therefore have organised today's event, and an elected BERA council member. I've got a special interest in coastal, rural and small schools, and I'm therefore really delighted to be able to host this event, and will be chairing it throughout. I'm joined today by experts in the field, Professor Daniel Muge, who's Dean at the School of Education and Society at Academica University of Applied Sciences. He was previously at Ofsted. Professor Carl Bagley, who's at Queen's University Belfast, and Professor Sonia Blanford, CEO of Achievement for All. Mr. Andy Wolfe, who's Deputy Director of the Church of England Education, and Dr. Kath Christie and Mr. Neil Short, who are from the University of Plymouth and Director of the National Association of Small Schools, respectively. We hope that today will provide insights and provocations for you and will enable collaboration co-creation for the first steps of a manifesto for small schools in England. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Daniel. And Daniel's our first speaker, and please do post questions in the chat while Daniel's talking, and we'll answer those at the end of his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about the role of collaboration in improving rural schools, and I'm also going to talk a little bit in my final slide about the new education inspection framework and what that means. So I'm going to discuss, first of all, some opportunities and challenges, and then some research we did specifically on collaboration. One thing to kind of start off with is a little bit of the background. And one thing we know there is that we have seen a rather strong policy focus in recent years on smaller towns and coastal areas. That's been a change. When you look back, certainly over sort of the decades when Labour was in power, there was a major policy focus on the large cities, London, Manchester, etc. Under the current governments, that has kind of moved much more to smaller towns and coastal areas. In particular, we've of course seen the recent focus on coastal towns. It's likely that that focus on smaller towns will only grow over the next few years as we see the preoccupation with kind of the red wall and the areas that have flipped from Labour to Conservative control in the most recent elections. But what we are seeing is still rather lack of interest in rural schools. We're seeing often as not really having many problems. However, when you look at the data, you can see that a lot of our lowest performing local authorities are in fact rural. That's of course not to say that we need to look at rural schools through a problem-focused lens. We have a lot of positive opportunities here. Rural schools are very much at the heart of their community, and when we look at a lot of the international research, we see that a lot of these schools are very much communities of learners where people feel very much part of the school and their parents as well. We see, because we often talk about smaller sizes, a deep knowledge of the children and the community they are coming from. We see a lot of opportunity among staff for leadership and involvement, and we see that staff are often a bit more experienced. You can see that when you look at the statistics in England, for example, and of course that has its advantages in terms of the knowledge that they have. We can see that the issues of rural isolation are very much at the heart of what a lot of schools are doing, precisely because they are so central to their community. And we often see a holistic education based on a core vision. And again, that's a real strength. So you do have that picture of schools which are focused, holistic, community-centered, and know their children. So there is good news, and it's important that we start with that, I think. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are not issues. I've spoken about this lack of kind of policy attention to rural issues, which we often see, and that, of course, goes along with a lack of funding in many cases. And the latest iteration of the school funding formula certainly hasn't helped in that respect. We see sometimes issues of isolation and distance. And now, when I say that, I sometimes work with Australian colleagues, and they always laugh with me when I talk about isolation and distance in the English context, because, of course, for them it's different again. But certainly what we see is in practice that does cause difficulties, and that caused difficulties in the most recent period, for example, where we have seen issues with the quality of broadband and internet connections, for example. We see issues of rural poverty, and not least we see kind of issues of hidden poverty in that regard. It's often less obvious than the poverty you see in sort of inner city areas, but it is certainly there. We have problems of staff recruitment, not least because it can be much more difficult to make the opportunities seem attractive for younger staff. We said, okay, we see on average experienced staff. The flip side of that is that it can be harder to recruit less experienced people to live in these areas. We see issues around quality of buildings and things like that as well. That's also an issue. Challenging leadership roles, not least because of the kind of often smaller capacity, which means that a lot of things fall on the same person. And to give you an example of that, I remember visiting a school and asking to, on an appointment, asked to speak to the head teacher, and was told the head teacher is on the roof doing some repairs at the moment. That's obviously something that you're not going to find in a big academy in the city. And you also see issues of low aspirations in the community. Again, that's a very mixed picture because communities are incredibly diverse, but we certainly know of some examples also from research where, for example, there is not an expectation that kids will ever sort of move out of the community or aspire to anything different from the opportunities that they have, say, in the tourism industry. So what do we do about those challenges? One answer, and I do stress very clearly that it is only one answer, is we can try and collaborate. So we can get schools to work together. Why should we do that? There are a couple of theoretical reasons for that, and I'm not going to talk about that too much because I don't want to mess up our time schedule for today. But one of those is what we call constructivist organizational theory, and that kind of starts from the perception that every organization creates its own reality. And when you think about a school and the specific culture of a school, you can sort of see that happening. When you go into a different school as a teacher, as a leader, you can feel that different culture. What that means is that schools can become other organizations as well. This goes across the board. They can become a little bit inward looking. And to combat that inward lookingness, it is useful to connect with a different, an alternative reality that we can find in a different organization through collaborating. Social capital theory is much more instrumental and is basically about the gaps in the knowledge and skills that we may have in our organization. All organizations have strengths, but also areas where they are weaker, and that, of course, is true for schools as well. For example, we may have fantastic teachers, fantastically good at language, at phonics, but maybe we might not have that same capacity in maths. So What does social capital say? Well, that's what we call a structural gap. And to help us fill those structural gaps, we can collaborate with organizations which have complementary skills. New social movement theory basically is about a kind of voluntaristic approach to changing our situation, where we say, okay, rather than having kind of top-down approaches to change, what we do is we work together, in this case as organizations, as schools. And in practice, you can see that where a group of head teachers, for example, decides to come together to collaborate, to make a difference for their children, and sometimes to act politically to make sure you have that kind of influence. Finally, the Durkheim network theory comes from the theories of the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who was very interested in the topic of why in some areas of France you saw higher levels of suicide than in others. And he said that is because in those areas you find what he called anomie, which is a lack of connections and a lack of connections to others, a sense of isolation, and a feeling that one's values aren't shared in the broader society. Now, you say, what has that got to do with schools? Schools don't commit suicide, and indeed they don't. But what you do see is that you do feel in some cases a sense of certainly isolation, disconnection, and sometimes the feeling that, say, national policies can be counter to the values of the school. And there again, collaborating, building those connections that lessen that anomie can be important. So I'm going to now talk about a little bit of recent research we did, which was an analysis of data from the database on pupil outcomes, which we matched the data we had on school collaboration. So whether or not schools were part of a federation, for example. We took out all the rural schools in that database and then used a variety of statistical methods to look at the findings. We did a survey of leaders in rural schools, which I'm not going to talk about that one today. And we also did a number of qualitative interviews with heads, governors, and teachers. What did we find? Firstly, we found a positive impact of collaboration. We found that students in schools that were part of the collaboration outperformed students in schools that were not. And that we found that being a part, and that was both true in primary and in secondary, and we found that being part of a network explained between 9 and 22% of the variation in pupil outcomes. Years on, here are a number of years that they were part of the collaboration. So after 2 years, it explains around 9%. After 4 years, it explains around 22% of the variance. What does that mean? That essentially means that being part of a network can make quite a positive impact on pupil outcomes. And those findings for rural schools were similar to what we saw in non-rural schools. From our interviews and from our case study work, we looked in more detail at factors associated with successful collaboration. And what we see there is a number of things. Firstly, trust is really important, and that it can be difficult and hard to build. What we see is that that's easiest where we have existing relationships. So where in particular, for example, head teachers already know each other. We may need to do some specific work to build that kind of trust, especially where we have competitive situations. So that may require quite a bit of preliminary discussion and sometimes also making agreements. So and making some clear statements about what you are and are not going to do. So for example, in one particular area, we looked at colleges that were part of a network, and what they'd had to do to build that trust was to things like agree how far the buses would drive from the colleges to pick up students so they would have some boundaries on competition. Establishing clear goals, that's always important in anything we do in terms of improving schools. And it's important to build in some mutual wins. So everybody in the collaboration sees some value to this. And you see here a quote from a head teacher in one of the collaborations describing how, in particular, development of shared CPD was something she introduced that was seen as an immediate win. Other elements that are important are making sure that there are some clear activities and some clear actions. What you see is that if you do not have clear actions, clear outcomes, that the collaboration can quite quickly dissipate, especially where it becomes more complicated to do in the first place because maybe you have to travel or whatever. If you don't see action, if you don't see a value to it, people just stop doing it. So have a very clear plan. This is what we're going to do. For example, putting in place shared CPD, for example, sharing resources. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Some constraints. In rural areas especially, we found that the value needs to be really, really clear, as distance can make collaboration costlier. Of course, in the current situation, we've all become very used to doing various forms of collaboration online, Zoom, Teams, etc. But we do find that some face-to-face interaction can be really key to developing those relationships of trust, for example. We also see a constraint in terms of a reluctance amongst parents and in particular governors to engage. And why is that reluctance there? Often because they are worried about the time that people are going to spend on these kind of activities and whether or not that will come at a cost to the education of their children. So for example, if a head teacher is going out and supporting another school, well, that means she's not available to work with her own school, and that worries parents and governors. So again, it needs to be clear to them that there's a benefit to their school and to their kids. And as mentioned earlier, what we found is that finance and resources amongst our interviews with in rural schools was seen as more challenging than in urban collaborations, but competition was seen as less so, probably because of the greater distances. So we see also that the need for collaboration is sometimes seen as linked to rurality. And here you see another quote where a teacher is talking about the differences in terms of location and proximity to things. We see that many cases collaboration has been driven by personality, so particular head teachers working together to lead it, or has been brokered by external bodies, and that can be the multi-academy trust, the diocese, the local authority, local higher education institution, so various people brokering that. And again, this focus on joint activities, joint actions. Just to say very quickly that international research into this area very much confirms these findings from England, and I'm not going to go through all these different studies, but this seems to be pretty much an international picture. And to finish off, a little bit of thoughts about the future for rural schools and some of the opportunities and challenges. So obviously, coming from not long ago from Ofsted, a little bit of reflection on the inspection framework, and that has both an opportunity and a challenge for rural schools. The opportunity being the lower emphasis on attainment, and in particular the problem that in rural schools, very small numbers of pupils can make a very big difference to those figures. A challenge, another opportunity is to focus on curriculum, because that's something that you have potentially got more control over than attainment. But of course, the issue there is, and that's the big challenge, that the perception that schools now all have to develop their own curriculum can mean that it can look like an impossible task when you are working with a small team. So there is one example of where collaboration comes in. There is no requirement to develop one's own curriculum. Collaborative development or buy-in of high quality materials can be a very effective thing to do. And that one of the things I'm doing in the Netherlands at the moment is developing a new knowledge curriculum that schools will be able to use there. Obviously, how can we develop curriculum? Again, collaboration to me is one of the answers to that question. Obviously, not a panacea, not a silver bullet. We don't have silver bullets in education, but I think it can mitigate some of the issues we face. I think I am more or less out of time, so I'll hand back over to Tanya for questions.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a really interesting presentation. So much food for thought there. We haven't had any questions yet, so please do feel free, anybody, to post your questions in there. While we're waiting for you to do that, because there's so much to think about, I've got a few questions for Daniel myself, being very interested in having done similar research in this area. So my first question is around multi-academy trust, Daniel. So I wonder where you see the opportunity in terms of collaboration that exists already through multi-academy trusts.
So I think there is potentially a lot of opportunity there. I think where a multi-academy trusts work well is where they employ the kind of capacity you have across the schools within the trust. So you look at, okay, across our schools, where do we have the expertise in science? Where do we have the expertise in maths, etc.? And we then try and deploy those experts across the schools in our group, working with teachers in different schools to develop the curriculum and so on. I also see opportunities for this development and sharing of common resources, again, taking away some of that burden from the individual schools. I see potential in terms of leadership, with leaders working together and getting joint development. So I think potentially MATS can have a really positive role in that. Of course, what we see in practice is we see varying practice and varying levels of capacity within the MATS as well. So the opportunity is definitely there. Whether that is so in practice, say it's a varied picture.
It's a really interesting response. I'm in the middle of a longitudinal piece of research with Rowena Passy, where we are exploring one MAT with 19 schools that is doing exactly what you've just said in terms of trying to create collaborative resources. But what they've actually done to mitigate the isolation of geography is to group their schools together in 5 hubs. And so they're co-located geographically so that opportunities for shared CPD, shared development for both teachers actually and pupils is there pretty much on their doorstep, rather than having that travel and those issues. So it'll be interesting when we finish the research to see the outcomes of this. But actually this kind of hub school model, as they've called it, seems to be working really effectively for them, sharing resources, and particularly in including the very small schools. Which brings me on to my next question, although we have got a few questions coming in now. I will ask it because you touched on it, which was in relation to subject curriculum lead responsibilities. I've seen some real challenges in small schools in being able to engage with those curriculum lead roles, and actually being part of a supportive MAT has enabled them to take those on from other schools and share those. Do you see this as something that will have to be developed because of the new inspection framework?
I think almost inevitably. I think if you're a small school, it's going to be pretty much an impossible challenge otherwise to get the people you have to be experts in the different subjects they are going to have to lead, because what you end up with is subject leads who are actually leading 3 to 4 subjects. Well, I mean, that is going to be a really, really challenging thing to do. And we know that's also kind of a practical challenge on inspection for those people as well. So I think it's almost inevitable that we will see more development of those kind of cross-mat in particular collaborations, where in a sense a group of subject leads across schools can work together to develop and be able to do the work. Otherwise, I think it's pretty, I'm not going to say impossible, but certainly very, very hard.
And when I talk later, I'll look at the policy implications of that in terms of Ofsted. We've got some great questions coming in the chat now. So because you're able, those of you who are with us today, to like questions, it does put them to the top of our leaderboard in terms of what we are. So from Paul Rickard, we have a number of small and rural schools and are seeing a growing number of mixed classes of more than 2 year groups. Any thoughts on how to support this, Daniel?
Okay, so again, that's obviously a challenge in terms of how you work with curriculum and also work around potentially adaptive teaching. So what I would say there is that it's really worth looking at curricula that go in cycles of more than 1 year. So can you work with kind of 2 year curriculum cycles, for example? Second thing I would say, it's worth looking at kind of mastery approaches when you've kind of got those mixed age classes, to try and make sure that as much as possible what the individual kids are getting is adapted to their prior knowledge and where they are and what they have understood about the particular topic. So obviously that that kind of necessitates a slightly different way of thinking, in the sense that we are moving beyond a kind of very age-based approach to more of an approach where we say, okay, where is that individual pupil at this particular moment in time, which is correlated with age, but certainly isn't only determined by age. But it is challenging, there's no question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's risen to the top of the leaderboard. Did Ofsted look at any small schools while developing the education inspection framework? And that's from Rob Blake.
So the answer to that is yes, absolutely, in 2 ways. In the initial curriculum research program that we did before developing the framework, we deliberately included a sample of small rural schools where we went into. And secondly, when we developed the initial framework and piloted it, we also made sure to include rural schools in that pilot as well. So the answer is yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. Really interesting presentation. I'd like to hand over now to Carl Bagley, who's going to present first, and then Sonia Blanford, and then we'll take questions at the end of their presentations. Over to you, Carl.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, I'm there at last. It's a long way. I'm traveling a long way from Northern Ireland. You know, sometimes we don't even feel as if we're part of the United Kingdom, but hey, who knows? Here we are in Belfast. Greetings, everybody. I'm going to really just cover some research that we've currently undertaken over in Northern Ireland. We're commencing a much larger study looking at the relationship between schools and their communities, small rural schools and their communities in Northern Ireland. But we thought as part of the process, it would be a good idea if we actually had a look as to what was out there in terms of the current research. So what I'm going to just speak to very briefly today is really an indication of what we found in terms of our key findings and our research which is actually based upon a particular paper that we have completed and undertaken, which is published and which is free to access. So you can all access this paper if you wish, which is really based on a scoping review of all the research that we found that had been undertaken in the English language since the turn of the century. And so what we're looking at that is all the research that's been undertaken in Europe on small rural schools. And we think that that is important, and it's probably a relevance today, both for academics that are on this call in terms of them understanding maybe where some of the gaps in the literature reside, or where some of the resonances reside in terms of their findings from their existing research. And also for many of the practitioners that are online today, really to show you, hopefully, in some ways, if it's any sort of consolation, that you're not alone in terms of many of the challenges and difficulties you're facing as teaching and being principals within small rural schools within the English context. So what I'd like to do really is just really fundamentally talk to some of the findings from the particular research that we've undertaken. As I said, this isn't my own research, this is research of others based across 30 European countries. And what we've actually found is, first of all, that from the research and so on and so forth, is that it's a good statistic to know, I think, that almost 30% of the population across 28 European countries live in rural communities, live in rural areas. So we shouldn't get sort of like too worried by the fact that rural living is not necessarily peripheral, it's not necessarily marginal. In fact, 30% of people actually live in a rural community of one kind or another. So what the research shows that, in a sense, rurality and the rural experience and the rural living and rural education is a substantive one. It is a substantive experience for a very, very significant proportion of people across Europe. However, that being said, rural living and rural areas differ markedly across Europe. Not least, for example, what the research shows is that those living in rural communities which are closer to urban areas tend to be more economically prosperous and active than those which are in rurally remote communities away from urban areas. And what's interesting, I suppose, from our discussions today is that it is precisely in those more remote rural settings across Europe that the research shows that small rural schools are located. What the research also shows, I think, is that actually how we define rural schools and even think about rural schools it is different and changes across different settings. Sometimes, in the majority of cases, that's based upon a normative reference to pupil numbers, somewhere ranging between 70 to 140 pupils within the school. In other settings, however, across Europe, we find that rurality is actually determined upon all sorts of different things, such as location and staff and so on and so forth. However, what we do know is that there are enormous challenges that are faced for rural schools across Europe, not least closure and amalgamation, staff workload, financial pressures, high staff turnover, dwindling enrollment numbers, professional isolation and delivery. But what we also know, and some of the things that have already been touched on, is that there are enormous opportunities for rural schools, close relationships with pupils and families, innovative teaching, issues around the potential for sustainability of communities, and also the ways in which we can work together in terms of shared networks and collaboration has just been talked about, and also maybe bespoke CBT for colleagues within schools. So all these things pose opportunities to face the challenges that I know colleagues in small rural schools are facing. In terms of what we know about research, well, we need potentially from the research to bring the children's voice more into understanding how children feel about their communities, and also maybe to understand the complexities of what it actually means to live in rural communities. But certainly there is a lot there, there's a lot in the research. Please read the paper. I know a lot of what's in there will resonate with what colleagues on this call are both feeling and experiencing and reporting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And we'll go straight over to Sonia now. Welcome, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Thank you very much, Carl. I'm going to take you through quite a few slides, but they serve to illustrate research that I've been involved with really over 4 decades, beginning with work related to how the smaller school can actually create the curriculum in a way that the curriculum is going to move forward, which is what I didn't do to the slides, the way that the curriculum can move forward in a collaborative way. And this is influenced by 2 people. Alec Clegg, who was the founder of Bretton Hall College in the West Riding, that's where I trained and where I first experienced small schools. And then Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson, who unfortunately passed away at the end of last year, he was a student at Bretton Hall College. He was also influenced by Alec Clegg, and no doubt the majority of you have heard of Ken Robinson and his real profound impact on curriculum development, particularly around imagination, creation and learning. So why are we here talking about small schools? Well, actually, if you look at the history of education within the United Kingdom, we have had small schools, we've had big schools, we've had medium-sized schools. They've largely been community-based. So whether or not they are, as with the school at the top, is a school based in Somerset, or in a more city-based school with the picture, which is a Victorian picture at the bottom, we have had small schools for 200 years, for a considerable amount of time. And the way that we work in terms of developing the curriculum has been an issue all the way through that time. So if we're looking at changes that can happen and have happened in terms of curriculum, we can have exciting curriculum, we can have hands-on curriculum, we can have very didactic curriculum. But what we really need is a curriculum that moves away. And I'm really glad that Daniel mentioned about the change and the focus on curriculum away from assessment, away from that continual knowledge base that is very didactic, that what we need is a curriculum that is going to serve those most academic, that are going to go to university, whether it's Cambridge, whether it's Harvard, whether it's a local university, but also those who are going to develop skills, which is every pupil that we engage with, develop skills in the future. And Nesta recently published this report that says, actually, the skills that are needed for the future are interpersonal skills, higher order cognitive skills, and system skills. So when we're thinking about the curriculum, how can we develop imagination, creation, creativity, and learning that underpins and develops every pupil from birth through lifelong learning in terms of their interpersonal skills, their higher order cognitive skills, and system skills? So we then have to think about, well, what's the purpose of schooling? Whether it's a small school, medium school, or large school. But for small schools, education, schooling and learning, the heart of the community and the way in which we develop. And humanity creates those conditions for learning. So whether we have 100 students, whether we have 50 students, whether we have 5,000 students, actually what we do need is to have that focus on the talent and move away from this highly systematized education. We need to move away from those industrial origins and go more towards the natural world. So we have to think about the culture, diversity, the individual community, schooling. We have to think about well-being in terms of compassion. And we've already heard Daniel talk about collaboration and then empathy and mutuality within the school. So I'm just going to go through 3 examples of where this can actually happen very much in small schools. So this is an image of taken from a rural school in America, where the school serves the community in terms of mental health, family engagement, community engagement, health service. The school is at the hub of the community. And if we think of small schools as being that hub, if we think of it in terms of engaging those parents and the families, and then we can overcome some of the barriers that currently exist within the small school community. We've already heard schools as learning hubs. Tanya mentioned that. One of the most amazing things that's happened over the last 16 months, and we have to think about the positive, is schools have become learning hubs through remote learning. And there is no reason why we can't focus on CPD and development of the Imagine, Create, Learn approach through schools as learning hubs, through the use of technology. And yes, we have a problem with some of the digital elements, but actually the majority of places are now overcoming those. So what does that mean for the curriculum? I'm a real advocate for the modular curriculum. Back in the 1980s, I led, post the Arts in the Curriculum report, a study into the modular curriculum. I worked in a school that was a very relatively small secondary school, and the only way that we could actually teach all the subjects to all the year groups was to have a modular curriculum. That was carried through as for the Centre of the Study of Comprehensive Schools, in how we can actually impact on the learning of every student, of every child. And we were able to take that modular curriculum, and in fact, the school that began from a very, very modest in terms of outcomes and the progression into, at that time, it was apprenticeships and into university, became a real leader for modular curriculum. So one of the things that we should be thinking about for small schools, as well as that collaboration, is how can we focus on a modular curricula that allows the input from a range of teachers, a range of leaders from that school hub. So I'm going to finish there, but just to think when we're leading on small schools, we have expertise, and we have expertise in families of schools. We have expertise that we've always maintained within the teaching profession. So if we can just refocus and move that lens towards imagination, creation and creativity and learning, and really focus on the purpose of schooling rather than the structure and the negatives, then I think there's a real strength in what small schools can offer society as a whole. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Carl. And we have a number of questions for both Carl and Sonia. So Carl, if you'd like to join us back on screen, that would be great. The first one at the top of our leaderboard is from Adele Gardner. Hi, Adele. It's really lovely to hear the voice of children being raised. And I think this question is directed at Carl, who mentioned the need to hear the children's voice. Now, I'm not aware of any specific research on children's voices within rural schools. I don't know, Carl, if you know of any. But actually, what would you support the focus of that inquiry to be on? So would it be around understanding children's perceptions of rurality or living in a rural community, or just wondered what you'd like to see investigated?
Yeah, absolutely, Tanya. I think you're absolutely right. There isn't any research, or we just didn't see it, and we looked at all the research that has been undertaken in English. There may well be done in the non-English language studies, but certainly all English language studies since 2000, we struggled to identify children's voice in terms of those particular studies. Now somebody's going to come online now and tell me, but you missed this one. I know, that's what I should never have said. I'm sure they're out there. Let me make it clear though that it certainly was not represented to any note within any of our scoping review. I just think at all levels it would be interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, I just think we need to know what children think. How do they feel? I mean, as educationalists, we're all about the child, and yet we don't know what the children's voice is in terms of small rural school experience. And I think that would be a wonderful thing to know. And I think it would help us all in terms of our professional practice and our understanding of rural life and rural education, small rural schooling, to find out what it was what did children think? What were their views? What were their ideas? I think that would be absolutely great. And I also think it's a bigger issue here in terms of the empowerment of children around the sort of human rights of the child and what the children's rights in terms of what their rights are, what their entitlement is, and how they have the right to express their own views and so on and so forth. So I'm a big believer that the children's rights and the Charter for Children's Rights, and something that we've explored and developed here in Queen's, very much around the United Nations children's rights issues. It's something that we should be able to feed into more, and we should be able to give a voice to the rural child into that dimension.
Thank you, Carl. I know that in Rowena and my research on coastal schools, we did a 7-year longitudinal study, and we shared the experience of the children in that coastal school as they grew up. And it was one of the most rewarding pieces of research I've ever done. And while coastal is included in rural understanding of communities within the urban-rural classification. So it's interesting, isn't it, that all coastal schools would be included in rural based on the way in which we split them in this country. We very, very rarely actually separate it out in that way to understand the coastal as part of the rural.
Right.
But in another event, I will talk about that, but not today. We have some more questions that are coming through. And this is, I believe, aimed at Sonia. So from Victoria Bamsey, I would be interested to hear more about the role of the community in rural education, not just in terms of services, but in terms of belonging. It's a really interesting question. Sonia, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is about belonging. It's about the imprint of the community on the learning that takes place in the school, and it's about applying that community learning that can happen within schools. So it's the curricular and co-curricular, and then it's also looking at the way in which we can transform the quality of teaching by bringing in the wider community. So the community isn't just about services. That was just serving to illustrate where community has really been embedded in terms of providing services, but it is about that sense of belonging. And I think that a number of the studies that have been referenced today have all had that sense of where do we belong? Where are we going, and how does where we're coming from going to help us in the future? So that sense of belonging within the community and that engagement with parents and carers is something that I absolutely agree with.
Thank you for that question, Victoria, and for that great answer, Sonia. It's interesting, actually. Chris Parnham's put in the chat, surely school asks their children's views. We do. Absolutely. Every school that I work with do have to call it a wellbeing questionnaire that goes out to understand how the children are experiencing their learning and their engagement with their school. But what tends to happen is that stays with the school, we've found. And what would be great is if that went more widely. I don't know if there's an opportunity here for schools to work collaboratively in sharing their children's voices. In our final speaker session today, we'll be looking to put together that structure of a manifesto, but perhaps this is something that we can call for a children's charter potentially around rural schools, around small schools, rural and coastal schools. But it's a really good point, but it doesn't tend to make it outside of the schools. And that's what we really need in order for change to happen. I think we may have. No, we haven't. I've been told it's time to wrap up on this one. I was hoping we'd have time for one more question. So thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Carl. Again, really thought-provoking presentations there. I'd now like to introduce you to Andy Wolfe. Andy, welcome, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and great to be with you this afternoon, and such a great set of speakers already. It's so interesting to hear just about prioritising the voice of children and young people. As it happens later in this talk, I'm going to share a little bit about how we've run our rural networks, all about developing younger leaders and placing their voices instinctively at the heart of education. So really lovely to be here. I'm Andy, I'm the Deputy Chief Education Officer for the Church of England. And as you may be aware, the Church of England runs a lot of small and rural schools in the country. As a result, it was able to publish in 2018 this report, Embracing Change, Rural and Small Schools, and really taking seriously the challenge that the Church of England helps to lead around 65% of all small and rural schools in the country, and obviously that percentage is even higher in certain parts of the country. And I just wanted to touch on a few things that we are doing about that, because obviously it's very easy to talk about how important all these things are, but you actually have to translate into like some kind of action. So one of the things that the Church of England runs is something called the Church of England Foundation for Educational Leadership. And if you just Google that or put in CEFEL, you'll find that. And one of the things that we have been doing over the course of that organization's existence is running programs and networks and research. And you'll see that 2018, one of the recommendations there is around developing peer support networks to support the professional development of leaders in the sector. We're really passionate that rural education should be instinctively at the heart of the education system, of policy, of funding, and so on. And we know that that isn't always the case. And these networks have begun to play a really exciting part, which I'll talk a little bit about. And also, reference there in the fifth recommendation around developing further stuff in ITT, which I'm going to talk about as well. So let's start with our approaches to leadership development. Excitingly, we were able to become one of the new providers for the MPQs, and one of 9 providers to do that. And although I'm very confident that all providers are very interested in working in all kinds of schools, I'm also confident that our bid majored on ensuring that the MPQ experience was actually really instinctively thinking about rural education. Ensuring that if you are a leader in a much smaller school, in a more rural context, you're not coming to a leadership development program where you're sat next to people thinking, oh my goodness, this is all okay if you're in a big school, but with a big budget and a big team to delegate everything to. But here I am, I'm one of 3 teachers in my school, I'm one of 2 teachers even. How am I supposed to implement this? And so throughout our curriculum design, right across the suite, whether it be in the new specialist qualifications, leading behaviour and culture, or leading teacher development and its relationship with the ECF, or whether it's at a more senior level in career, we're really seeking opportunities to contextualize as much as possible in a small and rural context. So for example, the MPQ leading teaching qualification, if you've got your head around that in its new iteration, really targeted at subject leadership, but clearly very different art and science to leading a subject if you're one of 2 or 3 teachers in the staff room, compared to if you're the head of history in a big secondary school and you've got a big team of that size to delegate to. Really important that we get that right. And then in terms of pedagogy, some really important distinctives around mixed age teaching as well, and so on. So we're really proud that I think we'll be, I don't know, I haven't analysed everybody else's narrative, but I know confidently that our offer for the sector is really focused on small and rural schools. And in actual fact, we're seeing a particular interest in the executive leader qualification, partly because the models of executive leadership are changing rapidly and will continue to change rapidly, particularly if the expected trajectory of academisation continues over the coming years. So that's a really exciting development. We expect to be working with around 3,000 leaders per year, right from the very tip of Northumberland to the tip of Cornwall in the south, and Herefordshire in the west, and right. And the thing is, we're really trying to make sure that we're a real presence in all of those areas, even though it's a bit more difficult to get things going in those areas at times. So that sense of focus on rural, leading academics, bringing that research base alive, those wider networks that we're running, really central to those MPQs that we are now running. So if you'd like to find out more about that, then please let me know. The principles that kind of underpin our approach, which again might be useful to understand, they're not specifically rural, I suppose, in some ways, but some of them are really important. So if you are in a rural school leadership context, that principle number 3, creating and sustaining communities of practice, we've heard about that from all of the speakers so far. The sense of how important it is to walk this journey together, not alone. We flourish together, not alone. You know, schools are no different to that. And obviously we're drawing on a range of research to underpin that in terms of those communities of practice, but we're wanting people to feel like they're not just doing a qualification, although that is really important, but they're actually joining a much wider community of practice, being looked after and challenged and supported by an expert coach on every program. And again, that will be happening in small groups at all those levels, so that staff are able to feel really empowered. I won't talk about every single principle, you can read them, but the sixth one is really important. We actually see this angle about focusing on rural, it is actually a social justice point for us, because it's not okay that the perception is that leadership development, professional development is very sort of metro-centric. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I think often it can feel like models and thinking are developed in large organizations where there are particular logistical opportunities, and they're not necessarily instinctively thinking about the small rural context. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we want to make sure that this is instinctive rather than not. A second thing that we're doing that some of you will have heard of is called the Rural Teaching Partnership, and just beginning to pilot this for this year. I'm really excited to partner with Teach First and with the Chartered College of Teaching on this. And the vision really here is to change the narrative on teaching in a rural context. It's not necessarily always the first thought of early career teachers to kind of, how might I find a job in a small rural school well away from an urban centre, for some sociological reasons, I guess. But we're trying to change the narrative, and we wonder whether actually even one of the spin-off impacts of COVID will be a degree of reticence for younger people to want to live in big urban centres, and actually potentially more likely to want to base themselves in more sustainable community life. And we're excited to see a bunch of new teachers starting in this September on the Rural Teaching Partnership, various parts of the country. There's a range of diocese areas piloting that, and then we look forward to fully launching that nationally in the following academic year. And similarly, like really trying to change that narrative so that we're not simply saying teaching in a small school is identical, and also we're getting rid of a kind of deficit model where it's just harder. It's not necessarily the case. There are some amazing opportunities for teachers and young people to flourish in rural education, and too often it's portrayed in a negative light. So that's a really exciting partnership that has sprung up. And as I say, the work there across three major organizations there, the Church of England and Teach First and the Chartered College, has been fantastic to see how that's growing. And we're really looking forward to welcoming the first teachers into those cohorts and seeing how their journey begins, whether it be in Somerset or Dorset or Yorkshire or a number of other places where people are going to be starting in September. Just trying to move the narrative slightly that teaching in a rural place is a great choice if you're a young teacher looking to start out your career, or indeed if you're a career changer, I guess. So that's another second thing that we're really trying to do actively. I think it's really easy in this space to be like very rhetorically correct and to prioritize, but really, we really believe that unless our vision is put into practice, it's not really our vision at all. And so these opportunities are making first steps in that. And then the third thing that I wanted to talk about is our Rural Schools Peer Support Network, that we've heard quite a bit about the importance of networking, and obviously many people on the call be very resonant with this approach. But over the last couple of years, we've piloted these rural schools networks in 4 different parts of the country, which have been amazing. Obviously not without challenge, not least because of COVID, and that's changed some of the ways that we're working with these networks and so on. But some really brilliant engagement where by leaders in small schools that are typically quite geographically isolated and so on, are coming together to work on shared leadership development priorities. And as I was saying earlier, one of the foci there has been around the nature of student leadership development. and student voice. I was interestingly yesterday running a student voice event on behalf of the Archbishop of York. The Church of England is about to publish a new kind of vision and strategy for the next decade, and we're really trying to make sure that children and young people's voices are at the heart of our strategic thinking and our vision and our communications. And I was running this event yesterday with secondary school students, and some of them were from urban schools, but it's brilliant to just be with those who are in smaller rural contexts and hearing some of their views on belonging, on acceptance, on the role of school in community transformation, on the importance of social action, which was fascinating to hear. So we're really trying to kind of walk the talk there in terms of how we model that out. I want to just finish with a attempt at a highly creative word cloud activity, and you know, what we're going to try and do here is I want you just to think about this question: what could it mean? What could the word instinctive mean for the sector? If we were instinctively rural, what kind of changes would we see in the sector? What might that look like? So if you take a look at the link there, if you head to Slido, many of you used that before, just go to slido.com. You just literally type in that code when you're there, and all you need to do is put a response in there, and we should hopefully gradually, magically begin to see this appear on the screen. There's always a slightly nervous moment when you do this kind of activity where you're not sure quite who will type in first, but what would it mean for you to for us to make rural an instinctive priority? Thank you for the first respondent there. Thank you. Keep them coming, and let's see what words kind of come up for us as a group. I think it's quite different to make something instinctively a priority than reluctantly a priority, or, you know, through gritted teeth a priority, or whatever. And I think too often we think about rural education as a kind of like second thought, or even a third thought, or even a fourth thought, or even not even a thought at all, because so many of our models are centered on very urban ways of thinking, which, you know, aren't necessarily instantly transferable. And we heard a little bit about that in previous inputs. How interesting. Keep them coming, and let's just note what's coming up on the screen here. Community, obviously seeming the big one. Belonging, collaboration, embedded. Community, I can see it everywhere. Community focus, know our community. Place-based, child-centered. Together. Family. I mean, sometimes these words are you know, one can caricature them in quite a dismissive way sometimes. Belonging, collaboration, it's all the kind of soft, but actually that's what we long for the children in our schools, right? You know, we want every child in the country to feel this sense, whether in a big urban school or a small rural school. So I'm going to wrap up there, and really grateful for your responses there. And isn't that fascinating to see what is growing before our very eyes on the Slido? But thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, all of these resources that are being generated by our wonderful delegates today will be able to be accessed after this event. We've got lots of questions for you, Andy, so I'm hoping we can get through most of them, and there's some statements here as well. So top of our leaderboard is from Matt Perrett, who says, it's so reassuring to hear Andy talk about the needs for CPD, like MPQs, bringing smaller schools together, rather than being with much larger schools with huge teams. I don't know if you've got any comment on that, Andy.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just think that it's too often the experience of leaders in smaller schools where you turn up to something and you just feel like you're not, you know, half of the stuff just doesn't make sense because it relies on a bigger team, a bigger budget, a bigger everything, more connectedness, even basic stuff like it relies on broadband, or it relies on particular facilities, which I think there's too many assumptions in all of those models that are actually very disempowering for teachers and leaders in rural contexts. And we actually need to celebrate those contexts. And frankly, the bigger schools, frankly, need to learn from the smaller schools in terms of leadership development, because my background actually is in leading in a big secondary school here in Nottingham. I mean, what a luxury to have such a team and such a incredible resources really on tap. But what could I learn from a leader who's managing all of the same demands of the sector places on them, but with a much smaller team, much more resource? So we really want, and if I'm honest, I don't know if there are colleagues from other lead providers on this call or not, but we feel that's really important for the sector to have, like, you matter as a rural school and your leadership development matters, because there's some key stuff in there. And it sounds very positive, but there's also some challenges, because typically we need to invest more in that, because if you think of the early career framework, for example, it's drawing on some particular research base, which is fantastic, but it may not be necessarily in vogue, if you like, in a smaller school context as it might be in a bigger urban map. So thank you, that's really encouraging.
Thanks, Andy. What you said there actually resonates probably with the second statement on the list, which has had lots of likes, which is from Helen Clark, and it says, Metrocentric, exactly how the new education inspection framework feels for small schools. And I know that in my work, we've been looking at metrocentricity, metronormativity in terms of education policy, and that lack of focus on rurality and the needs and the contextual needs of rural schools. So I think that's more a statement of support than it is a question. And I think we've got time for one more question. And I'm going to ask from Isolde Parker, our village school is under threat of closure. How can parents convince the MAT to involve the community in promoting the school through shared expertise? Big question there.
Well, I mean, obviously I probably can't comment on the particular school situation, but I think part of this is about changing the narrative about what we really value in community, and how children and adults can flourish in a smaller school context. And I don't mean that in a rose-tinted way. I know there's some serious challenges, and it's easy to kind of be sort of up about all of this, when actually some of the very logistical challenges are complex. I'm not naive to that, but equally I think we do need to find good ways of sharing good narratives about how essentially how uniquely brilliant an experience can be in a rural context if it's led well. I think that's the key, isn't it? Like it's ultimately, whether you're in a giant MAT or you're in a big secondary school or in a tiny rural primary school with 27 children that I visited last week, the art is still the same. It's about leadership development and consulting wisely with the community to get those structures in place.
Andy, thank you. That was really interesting, and such a wealth of engagement that the Church of England is having with rural schools and small schools. And I'm going to include, because of my own area, coastal schools within that rurality, and the specific needs that those contexts brings for the children and for the staff. So thank you. And actually, it's very strange. I'm going to be talking now and presenting to you about policy, but Kath Christie is going to chair my questions. So thank you to Kath. I've put together some slides that are actually quite detailed, but the reason I've done this is because policy is heavy. It can be quite hard to navigate. And therefore, I thought if you wanted to have some detail to look at after this presentation, then you would be able to do that. So I'm going to have a Slido question now. What do you believe has been the single most important policy-related factor to negatively impact on small schools? If you could answer that in the poll now, that would be great. No surprises there coming through. Funding, academies, Ofsted, oh, getting smaller and smaller. Funding is dominating. Oh, Ofsted's coming back, accountability. Nothing on academic curriculum or change to examinations. Okay, I think this is kind of balancing out now. So we can see there that funding is perceived to be the most important policy related factor that negatively impacts on small schools. Some people are seeing the challenge of exams, to SAT or not to SAT. One of my PhD students is doing that as a research question. Okay, thank you. So funding definitely came out as a particular challenge for small schools. You'll see from my headings that there are lots of issues that matter for small schools in England. And I think if we start by trying to understand what a small school actually is, there's no agreed definition of what constitutes a small school in England. There are different categorizations based on who it is who's been conducting the research. And so, for example, fewer than 210 on roll, Church of England, coming from Andy's document that he spoke about just now. Carter, fewer than 101, under 91 from the Audit Commission in 1990. So we can see a change over time in perceptions about small schools. For secondary small schools, under 200 in 1995, under 400 internationally in 1996. So there's very little agreement either in research, in policy, or even among school leaders about what constitutes a small schools based on size. So for clarity for this presentation, I'm going to focus on Andy's definition from the Church of England, which is primary schools with fewer than 210 pupils. I find this quite shocking, which is why I've said place and size matters. In 1980, there were 11,464 small primary schools. So that's 210 or fewer pupils within those schools. In 2018, that had halved. 5,406. So that comes from research by O'Brien. For large primary schools, the opposite is true. So in 1980, there were only 49 large primary schools. That's over 600 pupils. In 2018, there were 780. And as we'll see in a moment, the policy changes relating to things like multi-academy trusts and before that the establishment of academies can be seen to be directly related to this reduction in small schools. It's not just the structure of schools that's changed in terms of policy expectation, but also that funding that Daniel mentioned much earlier on during this event. So the trend is a reduction in the number of small schools, and these are located primarily in rural, also including coastal areas. So nearly a fifth of primary schools in England are in hamlets or villages. And we heard, didn't we, from Carl, that 30% of people live in rural areas in Europe. So this isn't marginal, but it does impact on everything that we do as educationalists in terms of understanding what policy should drive in terms of outcomes for children in schools. And what's really become evident within our discussions and questions within this event is that there's a metrocentricity that really does link to educational policy, and we'll see that coming out. So in terms of policy, I'm going to start from 2010, and that was Gove's era. Conservative Liberal coalition government, and there was a rapid and extensive set of policy reforms. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and it's never been as fast as it was from that period onwards. The idea behind these policy reforms seemed to be a school-led system that was underpinned by academisation, but we should remember that academisation started with the Labour government. It wasn't a conservative liberal initiative. It was actually an idea that we should develop schools that had been in national challenge circumstances to give them more freedom to develop a curriculum that would support the communities within which they lived. So you could actually argue that academisation had a good moral purpose to start with, to support the schools that were particularly challenged. But academisation changed as it went through different iterations of different political regimes. And there's a government there, there's a quote there from the government. Now, it'd be great if that was the outcome of these policy reforms. Balls suspected that the policy reform wouldn't do what it was expected to do, which was challenge inequality, and actually almost prophetically stated that it would create an unfair and two-tier education system in the country. That standards would not rise but fall, and fairness and social cohesion would be undermined. And I know from my work with schools, there are real concerns about the way in which policy is not treating small schools fairly. Academies were developed alongside free schools and studio schools during this 2010 to 12 period. And small schools over that period were predominantly grant maintained through local authorities. We've seen, actually, again from that Church of England document, which has been really helpful, that most small schools have a long-serving workforce. And we've had some hints about research identifying that small schools struggle in terms of recruitment and retention more extensively than other schools. And the work that Rowena and I have done on educational isolation demonstrates that actually that's to do with geographical isolation, socioeconomic deprivation, and actually a lack of access to cultural opportunities that really does make it challenging for newly qualified teachers to go to those areas. House prices are high, they need a car, etc., etc. And this can impact significantly on long-term viability. One of the elements that came out of consolidating the Academies bills was the paper, The Importance of Teaching. And from my teacher education background, it had significant effects on teacher education. But for small schools, the national funding formula is the interesting part of the policy that I'd like to focus on. Now, it was intended to address the variation in school funding by funding schools directly. But sadly, we didn't see any of that parity coming for small schools. It didn't impact on variation at all. I'll come back to funding in a moment. What I'd like to look at, though, also are other issues of education policy that, I'm going to be generous, indirectly or unconsciously impacted on small schools. So the rise of the English baccalaureate, the focus on an academic curriculum. We heard from Sonia that that we should really think about a curriculum, a modular curriculum that's creative and imaginative and allows our pupils to flourish in this digital age. The EBAC was really challenging for small and rural and coastal schools that had actually developed, many of them, through a curriculum that focused on the community needs. And I saw in secondary smaller schools that they were really investing in vocational education, particularly those who'd come through national challenge circumstances, to support a curriculum that seemed relevant to the context of their communities. SATs offer little in terms of a representative picture for small schools in terms of pupil attainment. When you think about it, if you've got a small school with a class of 20 taking SATs, it could be even less than that, or fewer than that, then actually the statistics will be skewed if one child fails to perform against the benchmark, in which case those statistics are meaningless, and all of the stress that underpins engaging with those SATs for those schools is not supportive of a positive community or well-being within small schools. Training our next generation of outstanding teachers came in 2011, and while it reformed initial teacher training to support more schools-led engagement, what it also did was really exclude small schools from engaging with ITT because they didn't have the staff numbers or leaders, the capacity to support becoming providers themselves. So they were actually becoming dependent on other ITT providers for trainees in their schools. And there is so much research to demonstrate the positive impact that initial teacher trainees can have on a school in terms of professional practice development for the teachers within it. So a real kind of missed opportunity there for small schools again, because of their size and not being able to engage with the policy in the way that large schools and urban schools can do. The Commons Education Select Committee report, Great Teachers Attracting, Training and Retaining the Best in 2012, endorsed the provision of school-paced training. So again, while it was endorsing it and encouraging a formal and flexible career structure for teachers with different pathways, these were two areas that showed a lack of awareness of a small school workforce. Time and time again, when I was reviewing policy for the chapter that Ian, Luke and I wrote on education, sense making of educational policy for small schools in the book that Rowena and I edited on called Exploring Teacher Recruitment and Retention, I found that education policy just didn't consider anything outside of the metro normative expectation of what a school was, which is particularly disappointing. I think one of the questions in the chat was around how are we going to influence stakeholders in terms of what we do around small schools. And I hope our discussion about the manifesto will support that later on. So let's get on to efficiency. Efficiency is a big driver of the government as it was and as it is now. And if we look at reforms focusing on creating large, efficient, effective schools, multi-academy trusts, we can see that the Blunkett Review in 2014, which was officially the review of education structures, functions and raising standards, challenged the efficacies of academies because of the way in which it may exclude other schools and have an undemocratic way of giving individual schools opportunities to escape contractual binding actually to the Secretary of State for supporting the communities that they serve. And we've heard the importance of communities in relation to small schools all the way through this event. Interestingly, the government's response to this was to actually develop the RSC, so the Regional Schools Commissioner. And the growth of multi-academy trusts expands the reach and influence of the most successful leaders so more children can benefit from their expertise, was how the DFE perceived any challenges to MATs in 2016. In terms of small schools evolving within the academy system, they've had little choice but to build and enter formal collaborations with MATs. And it's variable. It appears that this refocusing could be challenging for small schools, that MATs won't have the funding to support small schools. So the national funding formula really is something that we need to consider. Funding really does matter, and I'm just going to bring this to a close by focusing on some of the most important points of the national funding formula. It hasn't offered the anticipated significant increases in funding for small schools. In fact, you can see from the detail in my slide there that actually it's done the opposite. It appears to be uplifting opportunities for funding for small schools, but in reality it doesn't. And therefore, when small schools are looking at entering a MAT in terms of having opportunities to engage with more resources and more opportunities for professional development, it's hard for MATs to see where the benefit lies in taking them on. And therefore, the MAT engagement with small schools is variable. I've worked with some MATs that really do believe that small schools must be and should be supported. and others that don't consider them a financially lucrative, or actually lucrative is the wrong word, financially viable proposition to take on, which means that they won't be included and could explain the reduction in maths in our country over the last couple of decades. I'm going to end there. I've put in some references for any of you that would like to go on and read about that more widely. Any questions?
Thank you, Tanya. That was great. Thank you very much. We've got just a couple of minutes left for some questions. So I just wanted to bring to your attention a statement really by Katie Fitzsimmons that's receiving a huge amount of support, and that's recognising the compounding factors of staff costs, increased levels of special educational needs, per pupil funding and so on, that's causing this massive sort of financial crisis that people are clearly very animated about here on the Slido questions. But going to the next question from Chris Parham, is focusing on size a red herring? Surely sustainability should be the focus. What's your thought on that, Tanya?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think that size does matter, because it's the size of the school in terms of the funding and the way in which they can access resources as a consequence of the size that leads to some of the challenges that small schools have in terms of professional development opportunities, in terms of supporting those special educational needs students, which can be quite costly. So I'm not sure I'd agree that it's a red herring, but it isn't something that we should focus on with exclusion of all other concerns relating to small schools. So it's a really good point to bring up, and Chris has asked some really amazing questions and made some really pertinent statements throughout this. So Chris, I'm really looking forward to you taking part in creating the manifesto with Kath and Neil in a moment. So thank you.
I think we've got time for just one more question, Tanya. Then the next question is from Kate Newman, receiving a lot of support here. Will it be possible for small schools to maintain their independence, that is with a local authority rather than a MAT, considering where local communities want this independence? And I think that's linked to a statement from Elizabeth Farrow, who talks about having to leave her post as a head teacher because she felt so little support and this sort of constant fear of closure. So I just wondered if you could respond to Kate and this idea about independence and support local authorities and MATs.
Of course, Kath, and I'm really sorry to hear that, Elizabeth. Yeah, it's a challenge. So the policy focus at the moment is for the Regional Schools Commissioners to move all schools into multi-academy trusts. This has been a push by the government for several years, but it's actually becoming more prevalent now. So single academy trusts and local authority schools who are looking to get more resource to move into multi-academy trusts. Maintaining independence is challenging, I think, for any school. And again, coming back to Chris's point about red herrings on size, and of any size, because we know that local authorities can underwrite schools to go into a deficit budget if they need to, whereas multi-academy trusts and single academy trusts, according to ESFA regulations, have to run at cost. So when any school moves into a multi-academy trust, there have to be efficiencies of scales, and this can cause challenges of having schools that are already in deficit or are expensive to run. I'm not sure I've answered the question, and we need to move on to yours and Neil's presentation now, but independence is going to be hard to maintain, and the move of the policy is all around multi-academy trusts. So Kate, I think it's a case of watch this space, and let's hope that local authorities who are keen to support and maintain their small schools can do so for a long time yet. Thank you.
Tanya.
I'd like to now move over to Kath and Neil. So Kath's going to stay on screen and Neil's going to join us. And please do post questions. Actually, they're going to ask for statements within the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you all with us. First of all, I want to pay tribute to all the great speakers and some of the super ideas they've brought forward, highlighting the importance and the real fundamental place of small schools within the education system. I'm working alongside Kath here, so it'll be a case of now it's your turn, Kath, or whatever, when we time to move on. What we're looking to do today is begin the process of developing a small schools manifesto. It won't be done today, and we're hoping that you'll be able to participate with us. Kath.
Hello. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to see on the delegate list so many good colleagues and friends. Thank you very much for coming along. Yes, Neil and I are very aware that you've had a long afternoon listening to some amazing presentations. So we're going to keep this snappy and come to the point. We are, Neil and I together are going to propose that following this meeting, we are going to support the development of a small schools manifesto, turning the talk that we've had this afternoon into the walk of action. The word manifesto is about making manifest, making clear, making obvious. And we've been listening this afternoon to the issues for small schools in contemporary contexts, both here in the UK and in other places. So, Neil, you're going to talk us through how we're going to do this.
Yeah, we had a look at what we thought a manifesto might include and how it might be written. And we were conscious of a certain number of thoughts. I'm not going to read all these out because obviously you're quite capable of reading it for yourselves. But we thought it was very, very important to make sure that the word context, which has been mentioned several times during this afternoon's proceedings, we need to make sure that the context of the individual small school was actually taken into account. We also want to make sure that, you know, it's not a task to be ticked off. And a couple of points which have been highlighted earlier on, we want to try and see how we can inform the decisions that governments and other agencies are going to be taking relating to the funding and the provision of resources. And a final point alongside this, based upon something that Andy brought up, and as was mentioned earlier on in one of the questions, we thought it should be written in language which was going to be accessible to pupils, parents, members of the community, and therefore in sort of common sense speak, if you like, rather than too much educational jargon. And those are some thoughts we've had. These are not written in stone. And obviously, when we come round to seeking your thoughts and your views, these are up for discussion, as will be the issues that we raise on in a couple of moments' time. Kath.
Just out of interest and acknowledgement of our great colleague Juicy, who's here on the list of delegates. In Italy, there's been quite a significant focus on small schools, and it's the one manifesto that Neil and I have found. It's the put together by Indere, the Italian state education research organization, and so the Italian Small Schools Manifesto has as one of the objectives, it recognizes one of the objectives of a modern day country is to guarantee quality education in every part of its territory. And as their three key pillars, they've got this notion of communities of memory, quality of learning, multi-age classroom experiences being a resource rather than a limitation, and the technologies that we've spoken about this afternoon and social inclusion. Those three pillars seem to resonate a great deal, clearly in a different cultural context, but with some of the things that we've been thinking about this afternoon. If you'd like to look at the manifesto, I've put the link in the slide. Sorry, Neil, just trying to move my slide on here. Oops. So where do we begin, Neil?
Right, well, I think what we will do, we'll give colleagues a moment or two just to look at the list, and then I'll talk through one or two of the areas, and then we can ask them to select the 3 priority areas that they think are going to be key for the manifesto. So if I give you a second or two to read through the list, and I'll probably put a bit of flesh on some of the bones there. It has to be said that both Kath and I spent a lot of time debating what we should be utilising here. We've taken some of the ideas from the National Association for Small Schools Charter for Children. The community aspect has been highlighted a great deal during the discussions and the contributions by the speakers today. And we at the National Association saw it very much through the COVID crisis. There was a lot of emphasis by the work that small schools were doing within their own communities. A lot of work has been done recently about how small schools actually can develop specific aspects of teaching and learning. And in fact, the fact that they are small schools make it particularly valuable for them to be able to do so. Collaboration, we talked about and we've heard previously. NAS have been involved in some work with that and certainly see that as being a very, very positive benefit. Small schools, they belong to the community. They're a long-term resource for the community. And the way communities are developing at the moment and the way the world is changing at the moment means that you need to see the small school as the asset. The teaching teams links to the research engines for development because they can respond to change. Very, very positive, influential relationships with their local communities and with colleagues out and about. Centres of innovation. That I think is an important aspect that we need to be looking at. And the one that links with the comment that Kath has mentioned from the Italian manifesto, locality hubs and get it right, Neil, repositories for culture and history. How important is that going to be going forward into the future? It's good to see so many people contributing and thinking seriously about what's going on here. We will be taking these results and utilising them when we move forward.
This is really interesting, isn't it, Neil?
Definitely is, yes.
Can see how, thank you all very much for your contributions. We're also thinking of and making careful note of the some of the other issues that have that have arisen this afternoon. For example, the importance of including children
Yes.
in this endeavour, the importance of the creativity that Sonia mentions, the collaboration that Daniel mentioned, the shifting of narratives that Andy mentioned, and funding will no doubt sit there loud and strong in our list as well. So thank you very much for your contributions here.
I think if we can utilise and show the importance that professionals like yourselves think about the small schools, we might have greater input with those who are actually making the decisions about funding into the future.
So Neil, while we're if people can continue to do their Slido adding here, we'll just we'll finish off with where we're going to take this.
Right.
What happens next? You're going to deal with this, Neil.
Yeah. Well, what we thought we'd do, we'd try and hold a series of regional discussions. And in fact, this process is going to be starting in the next couple of weeks because several colleagues present today are going to be working with me. I'm going to visit schools and groups, and we're going to start the process more or less as soon as we possibly can. We want to be holding these discussions either face-to-face or virtual with the school leaders and teachers throughout the summer and autumn 2021. And then the idea is that sometime around about November, towards the end of November probably, we'll gather together a collection of interested colleagues and everything else, either virtually or again face-to-face if we can manage it, to bring all the ideas together and produce a draft manifesto, which will then be circulated to all colleagues, all those involved in small schools up and down the country. We're hoping then that the manifesto will be agreed and we will launch it in early 2022. And then be a full promotion by this to all the relevant parties that we've mentioned and to national and local government representatives. We also are going to be utilising, Kath is going to be talking to colleagues nationally and internationally at a number of conferences to actually put these thoughts forward to a widest possible audience. My contact details are there. And the next slide, if you look at the next slide, Kath, if you want to contribute in any way.
That went too quickly.
Contact Kath at Plymouth, myself, or you can get in touch with the National Association of Small Schools website. We hope you'll contact us as quick as possible and as soon as possible, because we want to get this thing going ASAP. We've had a fabulous conference so far, I think. We've got a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of get up and go. So I think the get up and go ought to get up and get going. Questions now, I think.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kath, and thank you, Neil, for a really sort of stimulating presentation about what's possible and how we do that. Please, can we add some questions into the Slido? So we've got a statement from Elizabeth Farrer saying, assets, yes, exclamation mark. Agile and efficient, absolutely. Centres of innovation, most definitely. Love these. So I think the positive affirmations around what small schools can do, are doing, continue to do is something that's really kind of come out from this event. So we heard, didn't we, from Daniel right at the beginning about what small schools, what rural schools are good at doing and what challenges they face. So Kath and Neil, while I'm waiting for some questions to come up, let's talk about the practicalities of the manifesto. So which stakeholders do you feel that we need to engage in this moving forward? Because we want this to be co-created and collaborative. So working with small school heads, small school teachers, but actually we know, don't we, that in terms of establishing impact of any directive, we need to get stakeholders involved. Sorry, I got a bit croaky there. So who do you imagine that we could take this to once we get to a point where we're happy with this later next year?
Right. Well, your colleagues, for one thing, Kath and Tanya. I also think that we should utilise a number of other organisations. On Thursday, I will be talking to a governor of a very, very small school, 20 odd on roll. And I think we ought to be looking at trying to utilise the National Governors Association. We ought to be looking at how we can involve parents more. And I don't know, at this moment, I'm sort of full of enthusiasm following the whole conference, that I think that the possibilities are endless, quite frankly. And it's just a matter of trying to clone me into 50 different parts, so I can be going around to all these different places to talk to people face to face, which is what I like to do. I don't know what you think about this, Kath.
Well, one point I wanted to make, Neil, was something that we discussed about the political context. We are aware that there are folk on the delegate list today, and people will be interested in this manifesto in all parts of the UK and in other parts of the world. So our thoughts were to produce a manifesto that could be used, that wasn't prescribed or linked directly to a geographical area, so that it could be used in Wales, Scotland, England, Northern Ireland in the UK, but also in wider spaces too. We're very aware that with devolved governments, there are different priority areas, and people may want to use a manifesto in different ways in different geographical areas. So it's quite important, we felt, that the manifesto should be something that is separate from or not linked directly to a political group, so that it could be used quite universally.
Can I just comment on that, because that's a really important point. When I was on Twitter last night tweeting about this event, getting overexcited as I can do, Karen Edge from UCL tweeted back to me to say there's a big movement in Northern Ireland that is looking to support and develop small schools, and is going to put us in contact with that organisation and with the people leading that. So I think the value of creating a manifesto that identifies the needs of small schools, or the intentions that small schools want, I suppose a manifesto is about intentions, isn't it? Is really important, because I know from my own research that actually isolated schools and small schools can be in ex-mining industrial areas, they can be Indigenous populations, in Australian communities, they can be in lots of different places that aren't just rural and aren't just coastal, even though we focused on that today.
I think the point that we've tried to make when we were discussing this was to make it possible to be relating to the context of the individual school. We all know that context is one of the key factors in education, and I think we've got to be able to do this and make sure it is capable interpretation by individual schools to meet their own needs.
Absolutely, Neil. And we've got quite a few questions coming in now. And so top of the leaderboard is: an integrated rural strategy is needed to include small schools and jobs, cost of housing, transport, future of agriculture, leisure used by non-residents. This is from John Fowler. My work, I talk quite a lot about the challenges of infrastructure for rural communities. Any comments on that in terms of establishing the manifesto?
I'm a member of the Rural Services Network, which is a local government network across the UK, and that's a really, for anybody who is interested in the integration of services. I'm absolutely with you on that, John Fowler. It's really, really important, and I really recommend the RSN, the Rural Services Network. They have an education group, also a health, transport, housing, economy, etc., etc. It's a really interesting group to belong to, and I certainly will connect the work we've done this afternoon. They're aware that the event is on today, and I'll be connecting in with the education group there. So that's one thing we can do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Small schools don't exist out individually. As we've been all just talking about this afternoon, they're not atomized, molecularized. They are parts of communities, and hence connected with everything. Absolutely.
Thank you, Kath. I'm going to go to Kate. Now, I've always wondered how to pronounce your name, Kate, because I've seen you on Twitter, Mariji Eid. So I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. I know I've got a tongue twister of a surname myself. So she says, what can we do as academics or as early career researchers, PhD researchers like herself, to support the development of this manifesto? And I think this is a particularly interesting question, because there are communities of early career researchers who are just focusing on rural research or rural schools research. And I know that there's a conference coming up in August by ISFIRE, ISFIRE. Please do Google that. I'm helping out at the early career researcher part of it. And I've got a presentation in the main part of it. It's free and it's online. So contribute to that. But Kath and Neil, any comments in relation to how academics can help?
Well, I would say that I really look forward to meeting you, actually. Thank you very much for your question. Join the one very good way that I've found people interested in rural and or small communities across Europe. There's a really good network in the European Education Research Association, Network 14. And I think that as academics, we all have a responsibility to act in our own local communities, whether that be academic, practice, schools, physical, geographical. We all have a responsibility as human beings to act, as well as to speak and write and whatever other things that we do. So, but also the ERA Network 14 is a really good place. Over to you, Neil.
And on a personal level, Katie, you and I have met face to face, and we're going to meet again in July. I think the thing that you could do was to get involved with the development of the manifesto, and you got a personal stake in it all.
Definitely.
There is a challenge for you, young lady.
Definitely. Yes, join us, Katie, join us.
And I think that goes out to everybody, all
Absolutely.
our delegates today. Please do
Totally.
take Kath and Neil up on their offer, because we're not going to do this on our own. This is about listening to your voices. As we were talking about listening to the children's voices, we want to hear what it is that's actually needed in this manifesto. Now we're coming close to time. I want to do a short plenary before we wrap up today, but we've still got quite a few questions in here. I think one of them is important to ask, which is from Tyler Ray Law, who asks, do you see a role for volunteers and parents for supporting and advocating for small schools in the manifesto?
Yes.
Good question, isn't it? Thank you, Neil.
We want to get everybody involved. Everybody involved. You know, we put a timeline. I think the 2022 is likely to be 2032, where the number of people are going to be offering their help. But we've got to make a start. And we'll draft something, see how it goes, and we always should be reviewing it as we go along.
Brilliant, thank you. And then I'm just going to sum up a few sort of statement stroke questions before we go into the plenary. So Chris Parnham has said, and it's a really good point, that he likes the Italian slide, so did I. I think that this is a social mobility, social justice issue. I would go for social equity, actually. I think equity is a really good way of thinking about the way in which small schools are treated within our current educational policy. And once we have equity based on place and based on all school contextual needs, then we won't have issues. From Stephen Youngs, he's asked that chairs of governors and governance be included in terms of the manifesto. Couldn't agree more. Governance is hugely important across all schools, very different in England to most other places, but the NGA is a good starting place, I would agree. I think I'm going to end there. There are lots more questions, and one of the things we're going to do is make sure that all of those questions are collated, and they'll come to me as chair, and I will be using those to tweet about over the next few weeks. So none of your questions have been wasted or ignored, and we thank you for participating and engaging so greatly in that. Kath, Neil, thank you. That was really useful. I'm excited about where this is going to go. A non-political manifesto to support all small schools across the globe. We're aiming high.
Definitely.
Brilliant. So just to bring together our event today, we've heard from a range of experts in the field on a range of different small schools, rural school related things. And my takeaway from this is that there is a rural-urban divide for schools within England, and that place does matter. And what we actually want is quality education for all schools in all places. Size shouldn't matter, as Chris said. You know, it shouldn't matter. But at the moment, the way in which our policy is created is very metrocentric or metro-normative, depending on which way you want to look at it. The rural living isn't marginal living. That 30% of people do live in rural communities in Europe, and that we actually need to consider things like how our curriculum supports quality of education in all schools. And we see that Ofsted is looking at quality of education, and they're looking at subject and curriculum, and that actually, if this is the case, then contextualizing it to the needs of schools by place is really important. We've talked about the way in which rural education should be at the heart of all of our thinking in relation to education policy and education practice. And we've had a call, as Andy said, to change the narrative. What I'd like to end on is the phrase that really stuck with me from today's presenters, which is, we've talked the talk, now let's walk the walk. Over to all of you, our wonderful delegates today, to help us create, co-create and collaborate on a manifesto for small schools. We will be having another event through the BERA Educational Effectiveness and Improvement SIG next academic year, and we look forward to seeing all of you then. But in the meantime, please do contact Kath and Neil and become involved. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a lovely evening. And I hope that our paths cross at some time in the future face to face.